Good evening. Before I begin, please note that all participants will be on mute. We welcome any questions you may have, which will be answered time permitting at the conclusion of Lianne's and Etiel's presentation. Please enter your questions on the chat or Q&A at the bottom of your screen. If anyone has a personal question for Lianne or Etiel or me, we will announce our contact information at the conclusion of this program. I want to thank Rabbi Moshe Shmerlo for his technical assistance. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the Rabbinical Alliance of America's website. Good evening. I am Rabbi Leonard, though many know me as Rabbi Yehuda Blank. I am the Director of Programming, Chaplaincy Commission, and External Affairs for the Rabbinical Alliance of America, also known as the Igud HaRabbanim, and want to welcome you to this presentation, The Forman Family's Journey Through Addiction and Recovery for Rabbis, Rebbitzins, and Chaplains, Monday, July 19th, 2021. We are honored and pleased to have as another one of our ongoing programs, presentations and webinars to inform, educate, and offer important resources of vital importance, such as this presentation. Lianne and Etiel Forman will share their family's challenges and discuss their daughter's addiction and how it impacted them. They will also address how stigma impacts sufferers, their families, and how communities confronting substance abuse, CCSA, the organization they founded, is addressing the issues of substance misuse and addiction in the Jewish communities through education and awareness. It is now my honor to introduce Rabbi Mendy Mirocznik, Executive Vice President of the Rabbinical Alliance of America, who will offer his introductory remarks. Rabbi Mirocznik.
Thank you, Rabbi Blank. I want to thank you for working very hard and making tonight's program, The Forman's Family Journey Through Addiction and Recovery for Rabbis, Rebbitzins, and Chaplain, a reality. I also want to thank Lianne and Etiel Forman, who will share with us, as Rabbi Blank said, their family's challenges and agreeing to discuss their daughter's addiction and how it impacted them. They also address an important topic of stigma, how it impacts the family, and how the communities confronting substance abuse, the CCSA, the organization the Formans have founded, are addressing this critical issue for the entire Jewish community. As rabbis, Rabbi Blank always strives with his committee to bring the best programming to the members of the Rabbinical Alliance of America, Igud HaRabbanim. But it's more than bringing a professional touch for the organization. It's also important to understand why rabbis must be educated with such important matters. This past week, we are privileged to start the 5th book of the Torah, where Moshe Rabbeinu begins his farewell address. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1, the Torah states, Eila hadvarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael. And these are the dvarim, the words that Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to all of Israel. His final departing words, a sermon that would last approximately 37 days, from the first day of Shvat to Moshe Rabbeinu's departure on Zion Adar. The obvious question pointed out, the phraseology of the Bible, the Torah usually states, Vayedaber Hashem al Moshe, and Hashem the Lord spoke to Moshe, and then Moshe conveyed the mitzvah, the commandment that God told him to command the Israelites in the desert. Here the Torah begins, Eila hadvarim, these are the words. Why is there a change from the classic way how Moshe Rabbeinu teaches his nation Israel? The answer that I saw was given was that Moshe Rabbeinu just handed the baton, the mantle of leadership, to Yoshua ben Nun. And from this point on, Hashem would not be addressing the nation of Israel through a Sinaitic command given by Mount Sinai, nor through the tent of meeting by the Oel Moed. From this point on, the Jewish nation, Hashem would make a vision to Yoshua, to the Nevi'im, and they would repeat it later on. Moshe Rabbeinu felt that Rabbanim must always relate to the needs of the generation, and it would not be proper from this point on, its final 37 days, in his farewell address, to speak to the nation as they were accustomed through a miracle, either through God speaking directly to him in that fashion. He wanted to speak to the children of Israel in the fashion that Yoshua ben Nun and future leaders would follow. Same thing here. For Rabbanim to be successful, we have to follow the issues of the day. We have to be aware of the challenges affecting our congregants, our community members. To meet those challenges, we always have to do like Moshe Rabbeinu did, Eila Hadvarim, to address the issues in appropriate context. So I'm very happy as rabbis, I'm happy that Rabbi Blank put this together. I want to thank the Forman family. What's unique about tonight's program is that we're talking from the heart, from real life experience. And may Hashem bless the Formans, the discuss and the merit of sharing this advice with us this evening. We should be able to help many members of Klal Yisrael come through these issues of addiction, fight the issues of a stigma they face, and all these problems shall be solved. Thank you, Rabbi Blank, and Shekayah to the Forman family.
Thank you, Rabbi Mirocznik, for your meaningful and valuable remarks. It is now my honor to introduce to you Lianne, who is a corporate and employment lawyer by training and is the executive director of Communities Confronting Substance Abuse, CCSA, and Etiel, who serves as executive vice president and general counsel for NOL, a global financial advisory firm. They are not only remarkable parents and role models, but are praiseworthy for sharing the seriousness of addiction also found in the Jewish communities and how they are making an impact about these issues and concerns. I now give you Lianne and Etiel for their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Blank. Thank you, Rabbi Mirocznik, and thank you for having us this evening. Not that we needed this to be any more real for us, but today is a particularly challenging day. Literally a couple of hours ago, we heard from a neighbor of ours that their 27-year-old nephew died from an overdose. This is somebody who was not necessarily in full-blown addiction, but a recreational user of drugs and happened to have gotten a batch that was cut with a deadly amount of fentanyl in it, and unfortunately passed away. So if we ever needed any more reminders that this is a very serious issue facing our community and a deadly one, today was certainly one of those reminders, and just wanted to share that. I want to start off by talking a little bit about our journey as a family. We are parents of 5 children. Our second oldest child, Ilana, is the child who suffered with substance misuse and addiction. She started down her journey with substances before high school. It was the summer before she was going to start high school. Late in the summer, Lianne and I were taking advantage of a quiet evening. We went out for a quiet dinner, just the 2 of us. And when we came back that night, we found Ilana drunk. We had never seen her drink before. We didn't really know what to make of it. And we simply put her to bed and said, we'll talk about this tomorrow. Her access to substances throughout her journey was through friends in the community. These were well-meaning parents of children who didn't necessarily understand that their children had in their possession substances, just as we certainly didn't intend that whatever wine or minimal amount of alcohol that was in our house was going to be used by our daughter. But that was that's what really began her journey. She tells us later that before she got really sick that first night, she kind of looked in the mirror and said, this is going to be what solves my problem. She described to us that she was feeling very nervous and anxious about starting high school. a very normal feeling, but she didn't use a very normal coping mechanism. And so when she was trying to figure out what to do with those feelings of anxiety, she thought about what she'd seen on TV and in movies. And there, what she noticed is when people were anxious, they took a drink. And so she found whatever alcohol she could find in the house. Didn't really matter what it was, poured it into a big glass and drank it. And thank God she didn't get sicker than she did. Throughout high school, she functioned quite well. She was a straight A student, really almost a poster child as a high school student. But she had relationships with friends who, as I mentioned, had access to alcohol and marijuana, and she experimented. What she didn't realize was that experimentation that she was engaging in throughout high school was really starting her down a path towards dependency on these substances. Her brain was being rewired. And Lianne will talk about that a little bit more about what addiction is. But that was really starting the process of her brain becoming rewired to really need those substances to function. When Ilana got to college, she had access to more and more dangerous substances. And again, because these things made her feel good, and because she had conditioned her brain to need them, there was really nothing that she wasn't willing to try. And that's when things really started to become problematic for her. It came to a head one night. It was Ilana's birthday. And we took her out to dinner at one of her favorite restaurants in the city. And she confided in us, and thank God had the courage to confide in us, and said, "Ima, Abba, I have a problem with drugs." To be honest, I don't remember much more about what happened that evening. I kind of went into a bit of shock. I think we said something along the lines of, "We're here to support you and help you. Let's talk about how we can get you the help you need." But honestly, I really don't remember much after those words, because as a parent, those are just words you're never really prepared to hear and to react to. She quickly recanted and said, "No, I've got this under control. Don't worry about it." But subsequently, in the weeks following, realized she really didn't have it under control and couldn't get it under control. We made her an appointment with a therapist who specializes in finding placements for people suffering from substance misuse and addiction. And one Motzei Shabbos, we got a call from her saying, "Okay, I'm on the tarmac, I'm on a plane, I'm going to Florida to go into rehab." Rehab for alcohol and drug addiction is rarely a straight line. There are what they refer to in AA parlance, white chip wonders, which are people who, are, only have to go through the process once, but they're called wonders because they're so rare. And Ilana's journey was no different. She met a young woman in rehab who at one point convinced her, said, "Let's get out of here. Let's check out of here," against medical advice. And Ilana decided to go with her. And for 3 days, we didn't hear from Ilana. We didn't know where she was. She doesn't remember much about those 3 days. She lived on the street, we think. She lost her cell phone or sold it or had it stolen. She doesn't remember. We had no way of getting in touch with her. We didn't know if the next call was going to come from her, from the police, from a hospital, from the coroner. We had no idea when we would hear from her or what we would hear from her. Thank God the next call came from another rehab facility checking on her insurance to confirm insurance information. She had decided to check herself back in. Several weeks later, that same girl came to her and said, "Hey, let's leave again." Thankfully, this time Ilana had the intestinal fortitude to say, no, I want to stay and see this through. Fast forward a couple of months, that other girl who left, who was finally going to get herself back into rehab, had one last night of fun before checking into rehab, and unfortunately overdosed and died. And so we often think about how easily that could have been us receiving that call instead of that other young woman's parents. Thankfully, she did see rehab through. But we, as Ilana's families, Ilana's parents and her siblings, were really suffering without any support. There's one particular poignant story. Lianne and I were in Dunkin' Donuts one Sunday morning. A lot of our story revolves around food, I noticed. We were in Dunkin' Donuts one Sunday morning, and Rabbi of our shul happened to be there, and he knew what was going on with Ilana. And He asked what was going on, and we said, oh, things are challenging. Here's what's going on. And Lianne, who has a tendency to occasionally just be the slightest bit cynical, turned to him and said, Rabbi, you wouldn't believe it. We must be the only people in all of Bergen County dealing with this issue because nobody talks about it. And he kind of, sadly smirked and chuckled and said, if you only knew. And that's when a light bulb went off for us, and we realized there's no way we should ever allow another family to go through this journey alone the way that we've had to go through it. And so we decided that to take it upon ourselves, after consulting with our family, we checked with every one of our 5 children to try and eliminate the stigma around substance misuse and addiction. The issues with our children those were interesting discussions. Ilana was more than willing to have us tell her story. She was just a few months in recovery at that point, but she said her one condition was that she wanted to make sure her contact information was available so that if people were struggling or needed help, that they'd be able to know how to reach out to her. Our other children, the younger ones, just kind of shrugged and said, if we're helping people, that's a good thing. We have a son who was going to be of marriageable age soon, and we said, look, you're going to be known, people are going to Google you, and you're going to be known as the addict's brother. And how do you feel about that? And he thought about it, and he said, you know what, somebody who's going to not want to date me because of that is not somebody I want to be with. And we're very pleased to say that that son is actually engaged in getting married in 6 weeks. And interestingly, the story of our family's journey appeared in Mishpacha magazine right before, I believe it was their second date. And so he showed up to pick her up for that second date, and her parents had the Mishpacha magazine article open. And so apparently it didn't scare our future daughter-in-law away. Quite to the contrary, I think it helped her to appreciate more about who he is and who we are as a family. But the stigma, the concerns around the stigma are real. And I will tell you, through our work, we see it all the time. We see people telling us, I can't talk about this with anyone. I can't talk about it with my rabbi. I can't talk about it with my family. I certainly can't talk about it with my neighbors because of the fear of the stigma. We'll talk more about stigma a little bit later. So we set out to see what we could do about eliminating stigma around this issue. We organized an awareness event. We went to the press, we told our story. And we set up the room that night. We had a local rabbi speak, a clinician, somebody who's in recovery spoke, and I spoke. And we set up the room for about 400 or 450 people. That was the capacity of the room. Honestly, I thought about 50 people would show up. And I remember sitting there as the room was filling up, and somebody comes over to us and says, turn around. And Lianne kind of said, I don't want to, and said, no, turn around. And we turned around. There were 700 people in the room. There were another 300 people watching it online. We had clearly struck a nerve. That night, we had the foresight to put feedback cards out and to ask the community, what do you want around this issue? And what came back were really 3 issues that were really important to the community around substance misuse and addiction. And that's really what formed the 3 pillars of CCSA, the organization we founded, and really guides our work to this day. One was a support group for loved ones of those suffering. We started that support group almost right after that awareness event in April of 2018. I think the support group started in May. We're now 3 years past that, sadly going strong. Interestingly, as a result of COVID, we had to go on Zoom. So now instead of a local support group, we have people from all over the country who join us. I don't think we can ever go back live, because how am I going to tell the people from Detroit and the people from Chicago and the people from all over the tri-state area here, that they can't come anymore. So we're going to be on Zoom forever. And these are people who often have no other outlets, no other way to get support. The second issue was around more education and awareness, and we've run a whole series of education awareness events in the community, in person, and now post-COVID, we've run them on Zoom on all sorts of topics, ranging from a symposium that went through a whole smorgasbord of topics available for people to educate themselves on, to a topic right before Purim around alcohol and Jewish ritual in particular. And then the third was really the schools. The community wanted to see the schools doing more around this issue. And so we developed programming for middle school and high school students, for faculty and for parents, which we rolled out into the 2019-20 school year. So this past school year, which was our second year doing this, we were in 30 schools. We educated over 3,200 students, over 1,200 parents. And frankly, we had to turn away business because we just didn't have the bandwidth. And that's something which we will continue to expand in the coming years. We see addiction as a community issue. It's an issue which deserves a communal response. And we believe rabbis need to be a critical part of that communal response. That's our story. Lianne's now going to talk to you about some trends and facts around substances generally, and then I'll come back and talk, and we'll both talk about stigma and what we can do about it. Lianne.
Thank you. So only one thing that I want to correct that Etiel said. I didn't turn around that night. I actually was too nervous to turn around. And the person next to me who was in recovery, it was his first time speaking publicly, and he was having a fit because there were a lot of people behind us. The amazing thing about that night, not just the showing of support and the number of people who came out, but the room was silent, and it went a long time, and the air conditioning was not supporting the capacity of people that were in there. So it was a warm room, and you can imagine 700 Jews in one place. There's never silence in that kind of setting, but in this case there was. So as Etiel said, we did strike a chord, and even when we first broke our story to the newspapers, we started getting approached all the week before that event, at the event, after the event, everywhere we went. People came up to us with their own stories of addiction in their family, brothers who had passed away from overdoses, and wives who were addicted to painkillers, and husbands who were struggling with alcoholism, and children, and siblings, and it went on. And it really ran the spectrum of people in recovery and doing well, to people in active crisis, to people and unfortunately tragically passed away. And probably at the time, nobody really explained why, because of the stigma around it. So how does addiction happen? We talked a little bit about Ilana and her journey, which is very similar to many people's journeys with substances. You don't wake up one morning and say, I want to be an addict. That's not someone's goal. And it's not an immediate result. You don't take one drink and the next day, you're addicted to substances. It really is a long time in the making. It's a process. The substances hijack the brain over time. They change the biochemistry of the brain. And really, when we were dealing with it as a family, we had to learn all this and reframe what we thought an addict was. In our minds, an addict was some derelict bum under a bridge with a needle hanging out of their arms. It was not a nice Jewish girl from, an all-girls yeshiva who was the star of her class academically in sports and activities. And like Etiel said, Ilana really was the poster child for her high school. A lot of friends and very socially active. But she now is one of our presenters in the schools. She is one of the people that talks to students about her own journey and educates them about substances and how her addiction happened. And what she talks about is what she thought was kind of just, typical teenage experimenting curiosity led her down this path that then became a full-blown addiction later on in college. We know we have an issue in this community because, alcohol itself is something, and it's controversial. People talk about dry shuls, kiddush clubs. There's a lot of talk about that, depending on the community that you live in. But we know that yeshiva students have a problem with alcohol and with binge drinking. Alcohol is introduced to our children at a very young age. I'm not preaching abstinence, do not get me wrong. But I am preaching good modeling. And when we talk to parents and we talk to faculty at schools, we talk about the messages that kids are receiving, both from social media, advertising, but also in our own homes and in our shuls. The impact of COVID was huge this past year for many mental health issues, including addiction. Like I said, we really had to reframe what we thought about addiction. We had to understand that it's a medical condition, it's a disease. And once you put it in that category and think of it under the umbrella of mental health issues, COVID was no exception. If you were vulnerable to mental health issues and COVID was isolating people and affecting them very deeply, those who struggle with addiction and substance misuse really, were very affected by it as other mental health conditions. The other thing that we've really had to deal with both in New York and New Jersey is the legalization of marijuana and how that, number one, creates greater access amongst our kids. it generates a lot of questions. Why is it legal? If it's, something that could be addictive or could lead to more addictive substances, why do people use it? Again, it depends on the community that you're in, but some of the rumors that we're hearing at this point is that instead of having Glenlivet or Macallan's at your kiddish club, now people have edibles. They have, edible brownies or baked goods that have THC, that's the hallucinogenic in marijuana, infused into the item so that they can get high from eating it. Etiel mentioned the support group. So what we find both very instructive and I guess very disturbing about this support group is that it really impacts everybody and it impacts every single community. We have had calls from professionals. We've had calls from rabbis and rebbitzins for their own loved ones. I'm not talking about for somebody in their community. We once got a call from a Satmar woman who said she's addicted to alcohol and painkillers. And she was at that point 3 days sober, and she was very proud of her 3 days of sobriety and just, I guess, wanted some chizuk. But we know and we see, every time we pick up the phone or we answer an email, we see that this impacts all walks of life. It does not matter you're rich, poor, female, male, old, young. It doesn't matter your socioeconomic status. It doesn't matter, where you are on the Frumkeit spectrum. It really, really is something that impacts every single Jewish community. We're not immune from it. And like I said before, it is a disease and it doesn't pick and choose. Unfortunately, some people are just susceptible to it and something gets triggered and it becomes a struggle and a battle. We really are disturbed, I think, the most when people say they can't talk to anybody. And I think that's, one of the reasons why we're going to talk a lot about stigma is because we want to tackle that. We want to eliminate it and shatter that stigma around addiction and substance use. The people who come to our support group and say, I can't talk to anybody in my family, I can't talk to my friends, I can't talk to my rabbi, I can't talk, it's sad. And these are people that are finding solace and comfort and finding other Jews who are going through this and can relate, whether they're there for a spouse, a child, a parent, a sibling, we're all sharing the same pain and the same journey. But we don't want those people to feel alone. And that's one of the reasons why 3 years ago we came out so publicly and why we're sitting here tonight so publicly telling our story, because, it shouldn't be stigmatized. It shouldn't be something that people are ashamed or embarrassed about. I mean, if someone, God forbid, had cancer, somebody might be private about it. They might not want to talk about it, but they're not going to be ashamed about it. So there's a really big difference between, shame and embarrassment and just, being private and confidential about something. And as professionals on your end, as rabbis, we'll talk about this more, but you should think about that too. Like, how do you treat somebody who's dealing with a physical illness? What kind of rules of conduct and sensitivities can you apply and give parity to when you're dealing with somebody with a mental health illness such as addiction? And the last point I'm going to make, and then I'll turn it back to Etiel, is when we have the school presentations, the most instructive thing we find is the questions that we get from kids. And we're talking about kids 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, who will ask very honest, very open questions. But one of the things that comes back again and again, aside from asking why is marijuana legal and why isn't the age for alcohol and marijuana 25, considering that's when your brain fully develops. One question that has come up time and time again is, what do I do if I'm worried about somebody? And what if that somebody is an adult? So we do talk about recognizing signs and symptoms of use and misuse. We talk about it with the faculty, we talk about it with the parents, but we also talk to kids about recognizing if somebody is struggling, coming forward, talking to an adult, bringing it to somebody's attention, saying, I'm worried that this person is having an issue. You're not telling on them. We talk about that very clearly. You're not, getting them in trouble, and they might be mad at you. They might get mad at you, but in the end, you might be saving their life. And, my daughter, our daughter, and my other presenters will often say, I wish somebody had told on me sooner. I wish somebody had told an adult, because it would have saved me years of pain and misery. And we've had very real situations where after we've been in a school for a presentation, we've gotten a call from the guidance counselor, from a parent, where somebody has come forward and said, this happened with so-and-so, I'm worried about them, whether it was substance use, whether it was other at-risk behaviors. brought it to the attention of somebody who could help them professionally or get them to the right professional to get help. And, you know, that's been something very rewarding for us that we see we're actually touching and changing lives.
So I want to dive into stigma a little bit. And I want to ask 3 questions. Number 1, why does stigma matter? Why does it matter that this issue is stigmatized? Number 2, why is there stigma in our community on this issue? And then 3, what can we do about it? So to address the first question as to why stigma matters, I want to talk a little bit about some research we came across. It's actually our daughter who found this research study for us. Research performed by Dr. Marco Venero, was published in 2018, and he was studying rats. And what he did was he took his lab rats and he put them in cages where they had 2 levers they could pull. If they pulled one lever, they would get a hit of methamphetamine or opioids, something that made them high, made them feel good. If they pulled on the second lever, it would open a door that would allow them to socialize with another rat. What he found, and these results certainly surprised me, is that over 90% of the rats would choose that second lever to socialize with another rat, even if it meant going through withdrawal symptoms, because they had already experienced the opioids and were already becoming addicted to them. So what does that mean? It shows us that addiction is a disease of isolation. It shows us that what people really crave is acceptance and socialization. The disease of addiction causes people to feel ashamed and isolated. Ilana talks about how her biggest fear in high school and later in college was being labeled a bad kid, being labeled as someone with a moral failing or character flaw. And that's one of the reasons she didn't reach out for help. And so if we can figure out how to eliminate this stigma, and how to keep people who are suffering and their families from being ashamed about these issues, creating a dialogue, creating acceptance of people, creating the right social environment and atmosphere for families and sufferers of this disease, we will not only help outcomes, we could help prevent people from going down that path to begin with. I think that asking why stigma happens in our community, I think we're just not educated about it. And it's, in fairness, it's not just the Orthodox Jewish community. It really is many faith-based communities that suffer from this. We have very high expectations of ourselves and our families and our community. And therefore, anytime we see something that we perceive as a flaw or a failing, and again, we need to reframe that and understand that addiction is not a character flaw or a failing, it's a disease, but we don't perceive it that way. When we see things like that, we say those things don't happen in the night to nice from kids. Those things don't happen in our community. By the way, it's not just kids, it's adults too. We do what I call othering. Things happen to other people. And once you do that, what you're doing is taking people who are suffering and often suffering in silence and just further isolating them. And so we need to get away from that. And we need to look ourselves in the mirror and understand that this is an issue that impacts our community every bit as much as it impacts any other community in the world. So what can we do about it? Well, this is a great first step, learning about these issues. And Lianne's going to talk more specifically about how we believe rabbis in particular can be helpful on this issue. But most importantly, we need to talk about it. We need to create dialogue about it. You know, those of you may remember back 20, 30 years ago, people refer to cancer as the C word. They wouldn't even mention the word. There was shame associated with it. Now we look at that and say, oh, that's old fashioned. That's not the case anymore. Because we've started to talk about it. We have organizations like High Lifeline that do amazing work with families that have people who are suffering from cancer. We need to talk about it. And we need to address the issue, and we need to be there and make sure that we're being supportive and sensitive to people who are suffering. If we can do that, we're going to save lives. I know it sounds trite, but it's 100% true. And we already see that with the kids that we're educating in schools, how just giving them the tools and the language to be able to use around these issues is helping people be more open about it. If we can get that generation focused in, in the right direction, hopefully there's hope. But we can't give up. We can't use the old dog, new trick excuse. For us, the older generation, we have to really push ourselves to talk about it as well. Lianne, you want to talk a little bit more about how rabbis can be helpful?
Sure. So, and not just rabbis, I mean, all community members and anybody who's listening to this broadcast. First of all, always offer support to the family. Understand that this is a family disease. It impacts everybody in the family, just like any other illness would or any other challenge. encourage greater sensitivity, especially around rituals and celebrations. So, we often use the example of a Shalom Zachar. If somebody offers somebody a shot, says, come on, let's make a l'chaim. If that person says no, don't offer a second time. You have no idea. I personally know very many adults who are in recovery from alcoholism, and they talk about the pressure that they have, Purim, Shalom Zachors, Kiddushes, it's really something to be sensitive about. And again, I'm not preaching abstinence, but you just don't know who might be struggling and who might be a few days into recovery or a few years into recovery, and you're, putting something in front of them that might really be challenging for them. Also changing the language around addiction and mental health generally. I mean, we talked about the C word, how people used to refer to cancer as the C word. We don't talk about saying somebody, she's a cancer, but we do say she's an addict. So why is that? I mean, if addiction is an illness and cancer is an illness, so why are we calling somebody by the name of the illness? No, it's somebody who's struggling with addiction or suffering from addiction. Even saying something like they're clean. Were they dirty before? So why are we saying they're clean now? They're sober, they're in recovery. Whatever other words you want to use, you kind of have to understand that language has that kind of impact and that kind of implication. And Etiel mentioned something which is really interesting. We actually were at a wedding a few weeks ago, and I was sitting next to somebody, and she leaned over, and she knows our story and she knows what we do. And she said, I just want to tell you, my nephew is struggling with substances. And I said, oh, I'm so sorry. What's going on? He's in college. And he was such a good kid. He was such a good kid. And I felt like following up with that and saying, is he a bad kid now? And we talk about this in the schools. Drugs are not bad. They're dangerous. It doesn't make you a bad person. Like Etiel said, it's not a moral failing or a character flaw. Drugs are dangerous. There's something dangerous, and they impact certain people a certain way and can trigger an illness. Very well-meaning, very concerned about her nephew. Obviously, her nephew is currently in crisis, and I didn't go into a lecture about, politically correct language around addiction, but it did make me think about that. Like, why did she say he was a good kid? And now, because again, that stigma of it doesn't happen to the good from kids. It doesn't happen to the straight A students. It doesn't happen to the ones, who keep Shabbos. And the biggest thing that I would say is don't try to solve it yourself. There was actually a study done in the Furkoff School at YU in 2014 about outcomes for people with mental health issues. And the outcomes were actually, it was tracked that many Orthodox rabbis tried to solve the problem themselves, and that they didn't send the person to the appropriate help. And, it was like a whole study, and I'm not going to go through all the details and the data. But part of counseling and education and training rabbis now is when to refer to mental health professionals, when to encourage greater communication, between the professionals and the rabbis, how that's going to advance the state of mental health treatment for, people in our community. Just like if someone came to you, and again, I'm sorry to use cancer all the time, but if someone came to you and said, I have cancer, you're not going to say, oh, let me give you chemo. Let me give you radiation. Let me talk to you about what treatment, I'm going to provide you. You wouldn't be presumptuous in that way. Obviously, you would say, I'm, very sorry, and offer them whatever support and help you can offer them, and support for the family. But at that point, it goes to a medical professional. So same thing with addiction. It needs to get to the next right person to take a look at the situation. Not every person struggling with substances is addicted necessarily. There are things like medical evaluations that can determine that. There are also people who are very, very reluctant to admit the issue, and there's a lot of denial associated with it. So sometimes just telling a person, you have to go into rehab, you have to go into treatment. No, there are a lot of other options out there. It's not black and white like that. There are a lot of other options, and somebody in that profession would be able to say, let's at least get him or her to a doctor to evaluate the situation. Maybe they're willing to go for an evaluation, and then maybe, hopefully, if they have a problem, they can confront it and get some help and treatment for it.
So before we open it up to questions, and I really do want to encourage questions, and I do want to say when we get there, nothing is off limits. So please, if we don't have an answer, we'll let you know. But there are just two kind of calls to action that I want to leave you with. Number one is around alcohol and shuls. And Lianne mentioned this briefly. But specifically, I'm not here to tell you whether the right answer is that a shul should be dry or a shul should not be dry. A shul should serve alcohol or not. I do know the right answer is that we should not glorify alcohol in front of our children. That I believe firmly is the right answer. But in terms of whether you serve alcohol or not, that's a decision each shul needs to make. What I do think is important for rabbis is to have that dialogue with your congregants. Understand what the sensitivities are within your congregation. Don't make assumptions that just because the way things have been done is a certain way, that's the right answer. Make sure that people understand the sensitivities around the pros and cons of having alcohol at shul functions or not. Again, making sure that it's served properly, supervised, that kids can't get to it, that people can't be overserved, that's a must. And that's not just the responsibility of lay leadership in shuls, it is the responsibility of rabbinic leadership in shuls. But what I'm talking about is really just engaging in that dialogue with your community, because just that dialogue alone in talking about the sensitivities on both sides of that issue are going to make it a better place and a more comfortable place for people who might be struggling, and will help to eliminate stigma. And then the second call to action is really around the legalization of marijuana. And this is really meant for those of you who are in states where marijuana has been legalized or is going to be legalized for recreational use. So we're talking New York, New Jersey, California, Colorado, Oregon, Washington. There are a bunch. If you're in the deep South, you're safe for a while. And I'm reminded of the chuvos that Rav Moshe wrote about smoking. And the fact that many people have said, oh, had Rav Moshe, known what we know now about the dangers of tobacco, he would have taken a much stronger stance around smoking. And I challenge you to educate yourselves around the issue of cannabis use, around marijuana, and understand the dangers of that drug to our youth in particular. And to, again, have that dialogue, talk about it from the pulpit, address it from the pulpit. We get calls. We got a call from somebody in an Orthodox community who told us, my son is struggling. His entire chevra of 30-somethings get together once a week. They go to shul and Shabbos, they go to Daf Yomi Shir and all that. And then once a week they get together and they all get high. And her son, unfortunately, is becoming dependent on the substances. So it's there. It's in every one of our communities, and now it's becoming legalized and more available. So I challenge rabbis to educate themselves and talk about it from a Jewish perspective, from a halachic perspective. How should we as a community react to that? So those are just kind of some provocative things to leave you with. And with that, we are happy to answer any and all questions, Rabbi Blank, that might have come in or might be coming in. I'm also going to put in the chat now our website address and our email address. The website has some great resources around substances, and obviously we're happy to try to be of help if anyone needs help in any way.
Hi. First of all, I want to thank you for a remarkable presentation. I'd like to share a few things. First of all, not too long ago, we had a presentation in a partnership with OHEL, specifically about mental health issues, and that mental health is not a disease, it's an illness, and that rabbis should feel comfortable going to a mental health professional, and definitely never to take it upon themselves what's not in their purview. We all like to think that we could be helpful to somebody, but sometimes if we give the wrong information, the consequences could be quite serious. So definitely what you said, Lianne, it's something that I've been promoting all along, is the importance of presentations such as this. The other is, I was on a professional webinar just the other night on the medical marijuana, and one of the professionals said, people don't realize, but the emergency rooms are going to start filling up, especially with the young people. And another professional says, oh boy, we just can't wait. And there's also been an issue, many people don't know about this, or at least they're not saying it, but it has been affecting marital issues between husbands and wives. Wives are finding it difficult living with their husbands who are addicted either to substance abuse or misuse or alcoholism. and it's really affecting their families. So this is not just an issue about teenagers, adolescents, or young adults. It is actually affecting families, and that's a very big series. I'm also in the planning stages, working on a presentation with alcoholism, and I am looking forward to speaking to both of you very shortly on doing some follow-ups that I'm working on, which I am hopefully that you'll be part of. And I have a whole resources of information that will be available, but the most important thing is that the reason I am working on all these presentations is simply that it's important to take away the stigma. And when you think about this, what's more important, being ashamed or not having a child that's alive? Think about that. Are you more interested, concerned what people are going to think about me or my children or a shidduch? Or would they feel more happy or comfortable knowing that they're attending a levaya of someone who could have been helped and we could have saved their lives? This presentation that you gave today is an eye-opener for many. We hope our rabbis, our members, and Rebbitzins. And the reason I include Rebbitzins, because very often many of the women feel comfortable speaking to the Rebbitzin and sharing some personal concerns with the Rebbitzins, not just with the rabbi, which is understandable. So again, the purpose of all of these presentations is specifically to not just be an eye-opener, but for men and women of all Jewish backgrounds, especially in the Orthodox communities, to realize that saving one soul is you're saving the world, right? What's the mantra? And we need to be able to work together. And please, anybody out there who's listening to this presentation and watching it, and it's being recorded also for future references, please feel free to give me a call or contact me at RAA Lianne, BLANK at gmail.com. I'll be happy to share with you the various different presentations that we're having and the resources, and to again call upon or contact the CCSA, which is being put on. And I think that, again, don't be ashamed, don't be afraid. And I have to tell you, I want to wish you, on behalf of not only the Rabbinical Alliance of America, but every person who's viewing this tonight, we wish you a hearty mazel tov. And I must tell you, it's gewaldic. I think I could get into trouble for this. I should say, we're all going to come and wish you mazel tov at the engagement, but I won't do that. So you don't have to give the address where it's going to be. But really, tremendous praise must be given not only to both of you, but to your children. All of you are remarkable, wonderful role models for all of us, for Klal Yisrael, and most of all, HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves you for what you're doing to save neshamas, and that's very, very important. So again, on behalf of Rabbi Mendy Mirocznik, myself, all of the Rabbinical Alliance of America, we all say thank you to both of you, and to thank our listening audience and those who have been watching this. And we hope that we'll go l'chayil l'chayil and continue doing wonderful things working together. And again, to Lianne and Etiel, I'm going to be calling you very shortly. So working together on and collaborating in partnership of things to help in Klal Yisrael. Thank you very much.
You know where to find us, Rabbi Blank. Thank you so much for having us, and you know, wishing everybody lots of hatzlacha in all these issues. Thank you.
All right, and I have one thing. Thank you for this presentation. I'm in Detroit. How can we get involved on a national, local level? Why don't you contact the agency that's listed there, www.jewishccsa.org or info@jewishccsa.org. This is not an empty request, and it's not an empty remark. They really will help you in starting something in your community. So by all means. So again, please feel free to contact me or either the Formans or the organizations. With that, may HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you know, we finished the 3 weeks, and not too long from now, we should always wish each other a ksiva chasima tova, a good gebench dir, and that Kadosh Baruch Hu should give us all the right kayach to do the right things for each other, for ourselves, and for Klal Yisrael. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.